All right, everybody, we are live, Dynasty Mirror Search for Huru, and I have the Professor Davis with us, the world famous Professor Davis. And today we're going to be covering.
Everybody, we are
Hold
live.
on, hold on,
Dynasty
hold on,
Mirror
hold on.
Search for Who.
There we go. Sorry about that. And today we're going to be covering, often, quite often, especially when I'm dealing with Africans on not even Africans on the continent, but Africans who have left the continent and relocated to either the UK or relocated to America as immigrants, and a few Black Americans here and there. But this is primarily coming from Africans who are no longer on the continent, who left and relocated to America, the West. We'll just say the West, as a excited individual in regards to being excited about the opportunities on the continent and building on the continent and having a platform like myself where I'm encouraging Black Americans in the diaspora to, to seek opportunities on the continent of Africa. I'm usually given the don't do it. It will not work out. It will be a failure. It will be Liberia 2.0. You know, and then of course, and we'll cover this another day, as far as on another subject matter, for another day. You have what's going on in South Africa right now as far as land reform. Of course, you'll get the self-defeated Negroes. Land reform should not take place because it will turn into Zimbabwe. But we're going to focus on Liberia today. I've been covering Liberia a lot lately. Reason why, I just think we haven't been told both sides of the story. Um, we're taught that Liberia failed or was a failed state, and it was the Black Americans' faults. That's what we taught. So we just wanted to set the record straight on that, and really wanted to address the self-defeated Negroes' excuse to not build in Africa because of Liberia and the so-called Black Americans' role in it becoming a failed state. So, Professor Davis, me and him are gonna address that today. So, Professor Davis, how you doing?
Oh, I'm exceptional on this Sunday afternoon. And yourself?
Doing well. I'm doing well. Happy Easter for
Thank you,
those that
sir.
celebrate Easter.
Thank you so much. And Dinus, the AME Church today was fantastic. So
Okay.
just had to say that.
So no Boule Church today. The AME Church.
Right, the African Methodist Episcopal Church. As I stated to you before, it is the oldest and largest independent Black Protestant institution in the world, which goes back to the 1700s, and it has a global reach stretching 6 continents now.
Mm-hmm.
And the AMEs have actually constructed universities across the globe,
Mm.
Africa, the Caribbean, etc. So it's a powerful institution that's done a lot of good work outside of just religion. So anyway,
All right. So this the subject matter. You know, Black Americans should not consider building in Africa because of Liberia 2.0. It will be Liberia 2.0 over there. Let's unpack that. Unpack
yeah.
that a little bit, Professor Davis. What exactly does someone mean, or what are they trying to say when they make a statement like that?
Well, unfortunately, the prevailing argument and point of view about Liberia is that a settler class, primarily from the United States and also the Caribbean, went back to Africa in the 1800s, established a brand new country in West Africa, and somehow this settler class eventually subdued and marginalized an existing population. And as a result of, let's just say, total immersion into this new society, what erupted in 1980 was a coup, which actually deposed or got rid of got rid of the so-called settler class or the Americo-Liberian class, and gave rise to, if you will, native Liberians. But if one takes a very, very long and broad look at the history of Liberia, it's quite rich, and it was a success story. And if you speak to scholars who truly know the history of this nation, starting in the 40s through the 1980s, Liberia had become a fully successful nation. By 1975, 76, it was clearly a middle income nation, probably the most successful country on the African continent. And one must keep in mind, Liberia became an independent sovereign nation in 1847, over 170 years ago, and it served as the elder state for the rest of the African continent. Liberia was one of the founding members of the OAU, now the AU. Liberia was also a founder of the League of Nations, the United Nations. Liberia served as a safe haven for other pre-colonial African nations that would come there to be trained and to be educated and so on and so forth. So this particular new country in West Africa was clearly a success in many regards. And because what happened in 1980, well, let me just say this. I think that blacks in the diaspora, black Americans, West Indians should not just say, well, let's give up on Africa. And that hasn't happened. Over the last few weeks that you and I have spoken, Dinus, I've given you countless examples. And one was Melvin Foote, who's a former, I guess, he was a former diplomat in Ethiopia. And he was so moved by his experience in East Africa that once he returned to the United States, he actually established the Constituency for Africa, which is one of the most renowned African-American led organization that's geared toward public policy in Africa. And Melvin Foote actually was the founder of YALI. And YALI is the Young African Leadership Initiative, which was put together under the Obama administration, where it brings literally hundreds and thousands of young Africans from all over the continent so they can be immersed in leadership skills, networking skills, and so on and so forth. And so this is just an example of how African Americans are still building on the African continent. Maybe not in Liberia per se directly, or in Sierra Leone, because I just want to say this too, Sierra Leone, the foundation of it is also, well, they were African Canadians, but before they were African Canadians, these folks had come from the United States, migrated to Canada. Then later on, in 1781, they migrated to what would become Sierra Leone, founded Freetown, and the rest is history. So just because Liberia was not as successful as it should have been, I do believe that the Black diaspora should still engage the African continent in some capacity, specifically, I think, through our institutions. And we have a lot of renowned institutions that can do a lot of good in really contributing to the development of the African continent.
Let me ask you this, Professor Davis. Why, when we bring up Liberia, why are we given this doom and gloom scenario?
Well, you know what? And here's what I think, man. I think that there are those who, how do I say this, man? Who really want to paint a negative picture of Black Americans, and that's not new at all, man. And unfortunately, I don't think African nations really do enough to teach their citizens who are going to A, migrate here, or B, come to school here about African Americans. Most people don't realize that Black Americans are anchored in all aspects of US culture. And without our particular narrative, the United States does not exist at all. It just does not exist. Yes, we were the chattel, but we were more than chattel, man. We built the country. We provided the United States with its primary wealth. Not only that, through forced labor, but through, oh my God, through inventions, through really everything. And so people tend to kind of overlook that fact, man. And as I stated to you before, one of the best things that we could have done is to construct that new Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture, because it's a national museum which encompasses our contributions to the American story. And it is massive. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, that museum is right across the street from the Washington Monument, one of the most symbolic I guess, monuments in the United States. And I say to you and others, no other cultural museum could have been built there.
Mm.
No Hispanic American museum or Asian American museum or even Jewish American museum, because those groups, yes, they've contributed to the American story, but African Americans are the most unique population in the United States because A, we didn't come here as traditional immigrants for family reunification or to live the American dream or to go to school. We were brought here, of course, as chattel to build the country, and we did. Again, we were responsible for the primary wealth of this nation. And getting back to your original question,
Yeah, go
a
ahead.
lot of people have a lack of understanding. A lot of people truly have a lack of understanding regarding basic U.S. history. Liberia is U.S. history, which we don't teach. We don't teach it here in the United States. The Liberians clearly don't teach it. And I can probably tell you that most African nations don't teach you
No.
about Liberian history. And I honestly think that's a part of it. I mean, it's just, there's a lack of understanding about this uh, particular period. And Liberia, man, was probably the most important nation in the pre and post colonial era in Africa. Nnamdi Azikiwe, who was the first president of Nigeria, wrote a book in 1934, I believe, and it was called Liberia in World History. And he's praising this free, independent African nation, man, for serving again as an elder state to the rest of the African continent. And unfortunately, man, again, because in the United States we don't teach this history, Liberians, unfortunately, don't teach the history, and the other African countries don't teach this history. Well, it leaves us where we are, man, with old negative stereotypes which are not true.
Mm. So why do, because when it comes to this, I guess Liberia 2.0 excuse, it's the majority of people who leverage this as an excuse are leverage this as to leverage this to deter Black Americans from taking Africa serious, primarily are African immigrants. Do you know why they do that?
Uh, I want to make sure that I understand your question. You mean, do I
Yeah,
know
so
why
basically,
African?
the majority of people who will say Black American do not, you should not consider taking Africa serious in regards to relocating to en masse or building, uh, something substantial en masse because of what happened in Liberia. I
Here,
primarily hear this from African immigrants.
here's what I would say, man. And if we're going to use Liberia and Sierra Leone as the measuring stick, I in some way understand their perspective. But here's what I would think going forward as we continue to look for places to settle throughout Africa. I think that one of the mistakes that was made in Liberia is that not enough African Americans actually migrated there. Not
Mhm.
enough Caribbean immigrants migrated there. And so we were never, ever the majority of the population at all. Black Americans and West Indians have a similar experience. We went through the transatlantic experience or the Great Mayafa, etc. And so those populations are fundamentally Western in their orientation, which is quite different from, if you will, traditional African culture. What I believe moving forward, Dinus, is yes, that we should continue to search and look for, let's just say, property on the African continent. But I honestly think that in this second go around, that this new society should be, if you will, populated initially by the folks from the diaspora, because those folks have a similar culture. You follow what I'm saying?
Correct.
Look, when you look at Liberia, like I say, there were the first 21 presidents or so were a part of the settler class, right?
Hmm.
And I think that there were two Barclays. President, I think I don't remember exactly, but both Barclays were West Indian they were they were from Barbados, and so there was no issue between again the blacks from America and the blacks from the West Indies, right? At all, there were no issues because again, very similar culture, very similar culture, and so. But again, I think that when we move forward, it should be some type of new enclave that is populated primarily by the blacks initially from the West. And I
Okay.
think that would probably be the best decision, man, because I think that in Liberia and in Sierra Leone, there were not enough immigrants who came initially. That's my own personal view.
Okay. See what questions we have in the chat room. And everybody who's watching on Facebook, I apologize about the mic cutting in. Well, Nita, is the sound okay now? This
I'm
person,
fine.
you're fine, but people in the chat were saying that the mic was going in and off. You're fine. I think the reason why we're having issues in Facebook is because pretty much you're using my mic for the most part, and my son, he was I had to address him, and so I had to turn the mic off, and I forgot people are listening on Facebook. Um, all right, Chris is asking, where could we go in large numbers without displacing native Africans?
Oh my God,
What,
Africa. Well, Africa has 12 million square miles. It's huge. I
mhm.
mean, let's kind of put this in context, man. Africa has 1.2 billion people, right? India has 1.3 billion people. Okay, so you're talking about, my God, there are plenty of places that African Americans could go. Plenty, so many. There have been examples, and again, Amir, you and I talked about this in the late 1890s. There was a gentleman by the name of John Lewis Waller who was born a slave in Missouri, who eventually became the U.S. ambassador to Madagascar in I think it was 1897 or so. He was appointed there, and he became very close with the last reigning queen of Madagascar.
Hmm.
And in a year or so before leaving, she had annexed 150,000 acres of land
Right.
to John Lewis Waller. And John Lewis Waller had actually made this land extremely prosperous. And he was about to invite thousands of African Americans to kind of settle that area. But later on, the French came and they colonized Madagascar, and they imprisoned Ambassador John Lewis Waller,
Hmm.
and gave him a 20-year prison sentence. And of course, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, I believe, it reached out to the U.S. government and said, "Listen, this is your citizen. Do something." And and Mercer Langston, a renowned African American scholar, was appointed his attorney and eventually got him off in roughly 2 years or so. But I mean, that was one example of where we were about to colonize. And I do think if that would have happened, man, you would have had a different Madagascar today. The country would probably be middle income
Hmm.
because Black Americans, 50 plus million people of African descent in this country, skilled population, right, in all areas. And they could have gone to that area of Africa and to really created something brand new. Now, that happened in Liberia, but unfortunately, because of a lack of education, some degree of jealousy about the settler class, it dissolved into utter chaos, and Liberia is where it is today because they got rid of their governing elites, folks who knew how to run a country.
Let
And
me ask you. Oh, go ahead, Professor. I'm sorry. Go ahead and finish your
no,
statement
it's
there.
quite all right. You're right. And so now they're in a condition where they killed off Tolbert and a lot of his political appointees, and of course the indigenous population came into being, and they weren't really equipped to govern, and so Liberia is still struggling to find its way.
All right. So, question number one, Nutriman is asking, what institutions do Black Americans have that is different from America? What can Black Americans do for Africa that is different from what
Great,
America
great.
has been doing for ages?
Great. Good question here. There are a number. Let me give you a couple of
Go
institutions,
ahead. Take your time. Go ahead.
like like you and I have talked at length about, again, the African American Institution, which was created by Horace Bond, the father of Julian Bond, and Dr. William Leo Hasbury. This institution has been around 65 years. It has provided educational opportunities, funding for opening businesses across Africa. The Africa American Institute has a footprint in all 54 countries. I also mentioned the Constituency for Africa, which of course has developed all of these programs for African students. Now, at the grassroots level, you have another organization, AfriCare, which works with the poor across Africa. And believe it or not, as I stated to you earlier, Adonis, that and I had mentioned that I had attended the AME church here. And I'm not talking about, now I went for, of course, it's Easter, but historically, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, man, is an independent institution that has been in Africa for a very, very, very long time, since the 1850s in West Africa, in South Africa since the 1890s. And most people don't realize, just as an example, the AME Church played a pivotal role in establishing the African National Congress. John Dewey, who became the first president of the African National Congress, was able to travel to the United States via the AME Church and meet with Booker T. Washington in the 1890s. Met with Washington, went back. He founded the Allonge Institute, which is one of the most renowned schools in South Africa. And this particular organization, man, it was the first organization or institution established by a black South African. I'm going to give you another example of how African Americans have actually assisted. There's a gentleman by the name of Strive Masiawa. He's from Zimbabwe. Mm-hmm. He is
billionaire, right?
Yes, he is. He is the founder of this mobile service called Equanet Wireless, right?
Right.
Dr. Lewis Sullivan and Andrew Young went to Zimbabwe in the 1980s and recruited him, brought him back to the United States. He was educated here for 10 years, attended Morehouse, goes back to Zimbabwe. He creates Equanet Wireless, man. And today the guy's a billionaire because of Black Americans, because of African Americans, you know. And so I can give you countless examples of how we constantly engage the African continent. And as I had mentioned to you before about Namibia, which at one time was controlled by Southwest Africa. And the Southwest Africans were marginalizing the Black Namibian elite. And so they thought to themselves, you know what? They were, the Black Namibian elite were a part of the German church in Namibia called the Rhenish Missionary Church. Well, the Germans were not properly educating the Blacks. And so the collective group of the Black Namibian leadership met with South African AME leaders, African Methodist Episcopal Church leaders, and in 1946 they did a mass conversion from the white German church to the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And if you look at Namibia when it gets its independence in March of 1990, a vast majority of the political leaders are affiliated or AME members. And this is an example of how this religious institution and political institution is actually serving, if you will, the African continent. And to add, man, the AME Church has built universities across Africa. They've built hospitals across Africa. And so this is an example of some of the African American institutions that are engaging Africa in a measurable way.
Professor Davis, how would Liberia be today if it weren't for the coup in the Civil War?
Wow.
We'll start off with the coup in the 1980s. If Tolbert wasn't assassinated, how would Liberia be today?
Clearly, in the 1970s, the UN has shown that Liberia was a fully and firmly middle-income nation in the 1970s. That's on the records. I would surmise, that, my God, what is it, almost 40 years later? I would probably say, well, keep in mind, the Liberia in the 1970s had a per capita income that was equal to that of Japan. Now, as you know, Japan is I think it's roughly the fourth or the fifth largest economy in the world right now.
Mhm.
I would say this to you too. I would say that Liberia would clearly be a first world country. I believe that it would be clearly a wealthy nation in West Africa
Mhm.
because you had the skilled leaders and polished, if you will, politicians who knew how to kind of not only engage the West but also the other parts of Africa, man. And I just think that it's interesting that when you that you know that other African nations who were colonized at that time, all of these folks, man, went to Liberia for guidance. And they never said anything about some Americo-Liberian elite marginalizing or enslaving, if you will, the native population. And again, a lot of this, man, has to do with the fact that that people really have a lack of understanding regarding the history of this region. And actually, what role Liberia has played in the freeing, really, of the African continent. But to answer your question, I think that Liberia would probably be a wealthy nation today. I think it would clearly be an upper middle class nation. It would be an example of what, if you will, a modern African nation should have looked like.
Hmm. All right, we have another question in the chat room. Nita, the video is online, so you can look it up there. Nita was asking if you could send proof that Black Americans started Ethiopian Airlines, but that's another subject matter. We've already
Oh,
covered it. But if you want to,
absolutely.
go ahead. If you want to, go ahead. We can cover it real
Abs-
quick.
yeah, absolutely. I'll send her that info. I'll send her. I give her my Facebook information and or email at the end, and I'll send her the link. Clearly, let me just say this: Colonel John Charles Robinson, who was really the father of the Tuskegee Airmen, he basically played a huge role in establishing Ethiopian Airlines. I share with you a brief story that Haile Selassie's cousin, Malcolm Bayam, was here at Howard University studying to become a medical doctor in 1921 or so. And he said to Haile Selassie, listen, I know an African American who can assist us during the war. And so Haile Selassie reached out to Colonel John Charles Robinson and says, hey, can you come to Ethiopia and assist us? And so Colonel Robinson goes to Ethiopia in the 1930s. Haile Selassie makes him the commander over the entire Ethiopian Air Force. And keep in mind that he's a Black American. And Haile Selassie makes him the commander over the entire Ethiopian Air Force, and he's rebuilding the Air Force. And so he also serves as Haile Selassie's personal pilot. So through the help of Colonel Robinson and the Allied powers, they defeat the Italians, right? And Colonel Robinson comes back to the United States. He builds an airlines in the United States, not an airline, but well, an airport here in the United States. He's called to come back to Ethiopia by Haile Selassie. Haile Selassie says, can you come back and help us establish an airline? So he goes back with Tuskegee Airmen in 1944. In that same year, they established Sultan Airlines.
Mm-hmm.
Sultan Airlines becomes East African Airlines. And in 1945, East African Airlines becomes Ethiopian Airlines. If you travel to Addis Ababa, which is the capital of Ethiopia, there's a huge statue of Colonel John Charles Robinson smack dead in the center of the city, basically giving him, paying tribute, paying homage to him establishing Ethiopian Airlines. That's a fact. That's not even a debate at all. Black Americans established Ethiopian Airlines, period.
Somebody in the chat room, maybe you could speak on this. An African American known as Emma Jaja helped open one of the first schools in Nigeria. Are you familiar with that?
In Nigeria?
Yeah, or what was to become Nigeria.
You know what? Now that unfortunately, I'm not sure about. Now I can tell her about this. Now I do know that Nnamdi Azikiwe, who was the first president of Nigeria, is schooled at a historically Black college. He graduates from Lincoln University. And so again, you can see how African Americans are utilizing their institutions, their HBCUs, their churches and other civic organizations to engage the African continent in a meaningful way. And this has been going on for well over 150 years. So our engagement across Africa is quite massive. And again, you can measure it.
Mm-hmm.
These are, I mean, there's evidence, and you can see what we've done over the years. Now, anyway, I was about to say something, but I'll let that go. It's Easter, so I would have behaved myself.
Oh no, no, please, let it all
No,
out.
no, 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 no. Well, what no, no, and I was going to say that what I'm waiting. I constantly ask my African friends, my African immigrant friends here, or maybe first generation Africans. I mean, are there concrete examples of how Africans have, in some way, used their institutions to engage the Black diaspora? I mean, what are those examples? And I have yet to get anything from friends of mine because and I don't know if maybe perhaps it hasn't happened or they just don't know.
Hmm. Another question is, should African Americans integrate into African society instead of forming their own country? Now,
You know what?
let's deal with that question from a Liberian perspective. Did African Americans integrate into, I guess?
Yeah, yeah. There was Tolbert had what he called unification policies, I believe, beginning in the 1940s, and so there was a lot of intermarriage. I mean, there's a lot of Liberian or so-called American Liberians who really married with the local tribes, and so I think that was it. But here's the thing, unfortunately. Again, the difficulty, especially within the hinterlands or in the rural communities, many of the Africans kept their traditional beliefs, and they did not want to, if you will, be westernized. And
Okay.
so, and so I guess that the ruling elite allowed people to kind of live their lives. And perhaps those groups felt somewhat marginalized because they weren't, I guess, they felt they weren't adequately represented within the political structure. And I think this was a part of the problem. But I do think that, to a degree, man, that the settler community did try its best, man, to integrate, if you will, the existing population into this new society called Liberia. But it was not as successful. Well, let me just say this: up until Tolbert was assassinated, he actually was able to hold the the ethnic strife in place. And then after he was assassinated, well, just chaos, basically, just if you will, became the order of the day. And again, Liberia is still trying to recover from that almost 40 years later.
All right, Professor, what happened to the, someone's asking in the chat room, and we could tie this into Liberia as well. What happened to the earlier generation of African Americans who were inventors and scientists? And how do we go from that to booty shaking and
Oh, there are a lot.
rap videos?
Oh, see, honestly, and I'm glad you said this to you too, man. I can see you right now, man, African American inventors in the 18th, 19th, 20th, and 21st century. So the individual who is asking this question clearly, perhaps, is not aware that there still is a plethora of African American inventors that are out here today. There's this, I guess, let me just say this, man. People don't realize that there are many, many, many African American cultures, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there are people like, if she mentioned folks who were part of this expression, I guess these people who are, what did you call it again? These
Twerking and booty shaking and rapping.
right. It's okay. There's that element of the population, but
Uh-huh.
also too, it's the folks that I know, man, who come from two-parent households, who send their kids to Harvard, to Yale, to Princeton, to Howard, to Hampton, who are doing things. And so I think that we can focus on the insanity. Yes, that's there. You
Mm-hmm.
have elements of our population that is, that's doing this foolishness. But by the same token, you have a lot of Black Americans, man, who are just polished and just incredible. And I think that it really depends on the company that you keep.
Hmm. Okay, and Professor Davis, what happened to the descendants of the earlier, I would say, settlers, if that's the correct term, of Liberia, the Americas? Like, where are
Right.
the that today?
Some of them were absorbed into the broader indigenous population. Others, after the Civil War, they returned to the United States, and many of them are living in neighboring countries, in Ghana, the Ivory Coast, some in Europe, and there are still families that are there. And I think that like Helene Cooper, who is one of the African American elites, she is a columnist for the I think the New York Times, and she came from one of the very prominent African American-Liberian families. As a matter of fact, Elaine Cooper is the great granddaughter of Elijah Johnson, who was one of the original 86 inhabitants on the Elizabeth, which was the first ship to leave and sail from New York Harbor. And he was really one of the founding fathers. And so some of those descendants are still there. They own property, they own government buildings. But again, a lot of them left because they were, how do I say this? When Samuel Doe assassinated Tolbert, many of the American Liberians were actually marked for genocide.
Hmm.
They were killed off, and so a lot of them were successful elites, and so they just basically returned to the United States, or again, they went to some of the neighboring countries, but they're still there in Liberia. And keep in mind that the so-called American Liberians were no more than 5% of the population. They,
Right.
they were never ever a majority
And
at
and, and
all.
and I think that's one of the beefs that from my understanding that the indigenous population has is that 5% controlled the majority of the resources, and that the indigenous people didn't have access to those
Right.
resources.
What
What are your
it
thoughts on
wasn't it wasn't that they didn't have access because some of the neighboring tribes were just as wealthy.
that? Okay.
And I think that also too that again, here's what I'm saying in regards to if we are to do this again, perhaps we would need a new enclave that is primarily settled by blacks from the West, African Americans, Black Canadians, blacks from the West Indies, because again, we have a shared experience,
Hmm.
you know, that is somewhat distinct from continental Africans, right? And so when those African Americans went back and they saw practices that were somewhat problematic, i.e., slavery, human sacrifice, these types of things, they felt like, wait, this is something that I really can't engage in. This is foreign to me, and you must keep in mind that I'm speaking of a formerly enslaved population, and and you're witnessing slavery on the African continent. Well, that's problematic.
Right. Right. Uh, Real quick, this is a little bit off topic. Are you familiar with the right of abode law in Ghana at all?
I've heard about it, and I don't know enough to really speak about it in terms of giving you, a detailed account of how it works.
Hmm. All right. Someone's asking in the chat room. This is a good question. He's bringing up Martin Delaney. Says Martin
Yes,
Delaney was sent to Nigeria and suggested. Well, Martin Delaney, he was in Nigeria, Benin, and Liberia, right?
yeah, yeah. I think he was there in 1859, I believe. Yes.
Right. Considering Martin Delaney was sent to Nigeria and suggested the Yoruba area for African Americans to repatriate, do you think resettlement would have been different had it been somewhere other than Liberia?
Excellent question, man. And again, I think, keep in mind the area in which Martin Delaney had traveled to, and Liberia, is still West Africa, right? And
Hmm.
this was the epicenter of the transatlantic slave trade. So it's difficult to say, and And here's the situation, man, that people must keep in mind. And as I said to someone earlier today, Pan-Africanism, this this idea of a collective African consciousness is not African. I want to say this again. Pan-Africanism and this collective African identity is not African at all. It is African American, it's West Indian. Pan-Africanism emerges in the United States, in the West Indies, not in Africa at all. And so oftentimes, quote unquote, contemporary Africans tend not to really identify with, if you will, their children in the Western world because they're Yoruba, they're Hausa, they're Igbos, they're Afex, they're Ado, they're BBO, they're Ashanti, Afante, what have you. They're all these separate nations. And African Americans are really, Black Americans are a unique group because, again, our ancestral background ranges from, again, as far north as what is now Mauritania, through West Africa, Central Africa, Angola, Mozambique, Madagascar, plus 25 to 30% of our gene pool is Native American and or European. So we are brand new people. We really are a Pan-African people. African Americans are Pan-African. We get it. And we can really identify with the entire continent because our gene pool is really a reflection of Africa. And that's just not the case for new African immigrants coming to the United States. And again, our West Indian cousins are very similar.
Hey, someone just brought up, something that we've touched on before. He says, why would Negroes build in Africa? Has Africa built anything for Negroes in America?
Okay. Oh my God. Now listen, let's just, and unfortunately, oh, wow. To answer your question, you know what? No. And that's just it's that simple. If the person who's asking me this question have continental Africans engaged Black Americans or Blacks in the diaspora in a measurable way, unfortunately, the answer is no at all. That's just not happened. I don't have any examples of continental Africans utilizing their institutions to really engage, let's just say, West Indian Blacks, Blacks in South America, or Blacks in the United States and Canada. I don't know of one institution, African institution, that has done that. And that is unfortunate. Now, as I stated to you before, I can give you a plethora examples of what Black Americans have actually done, man, to really engage Africa in a real way, in a measurable way. And I've mentioned all of the institutes, the African American Institute, the Constituency for Africa, Africare, what the AAB Church has done over a century and a half. And, and again, you can measure these examples. I mean, for even take Liberia, we've built at least 3 universities in Liberia. We've built a university in South Africa. And it goes on and on and on in terms of what we've been able to do. As I mentioned to you before, we African Americans wrote the Constitution in Kenya. Thurgood Marshall, at the request of Kenyatta and Thomas Mboya, who was a labor expert in Kenya, had requested Thurgood Marshall, our first justice, Supreme Court justice. They requested that he come to Kenya and write the Constitution, which he did. So again, you can see where, again, the Black diaspora has engaged and is engaging. Even up until today, and I mentioned this to you again, YALI, which means Young African Leadership Initiative, which is all over the African continent. So to get back to your original question, unfortunately, continental Africans have not used their institutions to engage the Black diaspora in any meaningful way that I know of. And and I wish that I could give the gentleman or the young lady who asked that question an example, but unfortunately, I cannot.
Well, there it is. Let's see what other questions we have in the chat room. Um, in the chat room, someone said the new generation Africans like myself will build for the African Americans, trust and believe. What do you think about that
Well,
comment?
no, and again, I think that I think that's fine, man. I think that new immigrants see, and let me just say this to you too. With Caribbean immigrants, I don't have a really issue with them because their experience is very similar to ours, right?
Mhm.
What I would hope that that the African immigrants who are coming to the West, specifically to the United States, that they'll take the time to learn the history of the United States, and because I tell them that American history, African American history is American history. They're here because of the 500-year struggle of the African American experience,
Mhm.
right? I
Right.
mean, they basically are benefiting from from the history of people who went through hundreds of years of being terrorized, 250 years of being enslaved, 100 years of Jim Crow, decades of bad public policy decisions. And these people were still able to give something back to the African continent, which is that's what's really amazing to me. Here it is, a marginal population, man, in a predominantly white society was still able to kind of reach back and and provide assistance to the African continent. Now, again, has the African continent did that for blacks in the United States or in the West or in the Western world? From my knowledge, absolutely not. There is no, I don't know of one institution, one African-led institution that has said to, I don't know, Jamaicans or Haitians or someone else, let's make your plight better. It just hasn't happened. It just hasn't happened. I mean, and that's unfortunate. And oftentimes, I think that we get the immigrants who come here, and oftentimes they're from the elite. And here's what I truly believe, Dinas.
Go ahead.
Many of the immigrants who come to the United States are, unfortunately, they are the descendants of the people who were complicit in slavery, right?
Right.
And those are the folks, man, who are still in power across Africa. And and they are not allowing their own citizens there, man, to to grow and to prosper and to develop, which is somewhat problematic. See, and the ones who are very patronizing to Black Americans, which is unfortunate, man. It shows to me when they do that is that they have a lack of understanding regarding the history
Hey, Professor Davis, not to
of the
cut you off,
Black.
but I have to
Sure,
ask this question.
sure.
Haile Selassie gave land to the Jamaicans. Is that true?
You know
Do you
what? I don't know this, but I can tell you this. Are you familiar with William Ellis?
I'm not. No.
William Ellis was an African American born into slavery, Victoria, Texas, in the 1860s. He became kind of an unofficial ambassador to Ethiopia. As a matter of fact, in 190, well, I'll say this. In 1899, he went to Ethiopia and he met with King Menelik. And believe it or not, man, Menelik actually annexed land to William Ellis. And he became a cotton farmer in Ethiopia, quite successful.
Uh-huh.
And William Ellis was, believe it or not, man, he was the first African American millionaire on Wall Street.
Hmm.
But but let me just say this to you too. One of the reasons why he was able to kind of become so successful on Wall Street, he had changed his identity from William Ellis to Guillermo something else. He said he was claiming to be a Mexican, if you will, business person, and no one knew that he was actually an African American, where his family came from Tennessee years ago. But this guy ended up going back to Ethiopia in 1904 and establishing official diplomatic relationship between the United States and Ethiopia. And so what I'm saying to you is that King Menelik did give land to William Ellis to grow cotton, and he was very successful. But
Okay.
with the Jamaicans, I'm not sure about that at all.
Okay. And then somebody else mentioned He said Selassie gave a little land to Rastafarians, but the very few Rastafarians are still there.
Right.
Uh, let's see here. Oh, agriculture. So anti-gravity 74 is asking, how does he convince Black agribusiness professionals? By the way, I have my degree is in agricultural business from the University of Georgia. Thought I'd put that out there.
Thank you.
Agribusiness professionals to invest and build agricultural and agribusiness supply chains in Africa with their expertise.
You know what, Dinus, I'm going to defer to you in
Uh,
regards to that question
I,
because
I wish
honestly,
I wish I had a solution, but I think many agribusiness professionals, just from what I understand, here in Georgia, are just so what's the word I want to use? I'm trying to use a different word from disgruntled, but they've been pretty much, excuse my language, shitted on because of racism in the agribusiness arena. That some have given up. I mean, even when we're dealing with arable land that's been passed on from generation to generation, a lot of the heirs to it have actually sold it off. So as far as the Black farmer here in America, the Black farmer is going extinct.
this is true.
Because I mean, the kids, they're not taking it up. So I think a lot of them are just so not disgruntled, but I want to use another word. They're not now. I don't want to use the word not motivated. They're just, I mean, just the effects of racism that they have to deal with, again, in farming and agribusiness, that they just kind of are somewhat giving up. I mean, there are Black farmers in Louisiana, but from my understanding, like the kids, the millennials, they're moving on from farming. So
Interesting. Interesting.
yeah, so that's basically what's going on there. So it's going to be hard to convince Black farmers to go to Africa when, I mean, they pretty much have no sense of hope here in America. Because I mean, the issue with a lot of Black people versus other ethnicities and people, they have no issue with packing up and going to where the opportunity is, even if that's leaving
Right.
uh, the
Right.
where they're at, leaving
Right.
China, leaving Korea, or leaving
Yeah.
India. But as far as
Yeah.
Black people, it's sometimes hard to convince Black people to leave their neighborhood.
Yeah, that's true. And let me just say this, man. I truly believe that for it to work going forward is there going to have to be a clear understanding. And I think that initially, what will have to happen is that, again, this enclave of folks from the Americas, from the United States, Canada, Blacks from the West Indies, because we're similar. We're very, very similar. And again, and Liberia was an example of how that worked. Uh, the settler community that established Liberia and Sierra Leone were primarily folks who had come from the diaspora. And at one point, I know we're talking about Liberia, but Sierra Leone for a long time, man, was a very, very successful area. The difference between Sierra Leone and Liberia is that Liberia was independent and Sierra Leone was still under British occupation, but successful. And so I think that a lot of it, has had to do with the fact that, again, we had a very, very, very integrated culture.
Right.
We were Westerners, and so that's what needs to happen. But clearly, we should engage Africa. But I just think that the engagement must be at the level of our institutions, because again, right now, most African nations are in no position to absorb large numbers of Blacks from the diaspora. They're just not there at all. They're just not ready. As a matter of fact, they have not. They're not. They're really not in the position to kind of provide a quality of life for their own citizens, and that's how I see it.
All right, perfect. Let's see what other questions we have in the chat room here. But yeah, Professor Davis, it's always a pleasure for you an honor for you to come on. I mean, people, they really appreciate you coming on and dropping the jewels that you drop and information that you give.
Oh,
So,
sure, sure. And let me just say this, man. And I just wish, and I've got to say this, and I really want specifically African Americans to know that we have an amazing history. I mean, a truly amazing history, man. I'm telling you. And honestly, there's not enough of us who know the contributions that we've made to the United States, and to the world. I tell my students all the time, Dinus, that as I said to you before, Black American culture or African American culture is anchored in every aspect of U.S. history. That can be said of Canada as well. For example, as I had mentioned to you before, Viola Desmond, who appears on the Canadian $10 bill this year, she is sometimes known as the Rosa Parks of Canada. If you take a critical look at her background, man, she's a descendant of the Black Loyalists, and the Black Loyalists were formerly enslaved African Americans in the United States. And when you look at Black Canadian culture, man, up until 1965, man, almost all Blacks had come from the United States. And if you look at the Black institutions across Canada, man, most of them were actually established by early African Americans who had gone to Canada as early as the 1690s, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, etc., bringing their culture, building institutions across Canada as well.
mhm.
And so this is a part of our legacy as well. But far too many Black Americans tend to kind of marginalize or actually speak negatively about their own history, which is really massive. I mean, what we've accomplished is pretty incredible. Being under subjugation, that's pretty amazing. And I'll say this to you, and I'll just say this as well, man. Oftentimes, when the Ivy League institutions will try to kind of play games, and in some ways try to suggest like, well, how do I say this? I mean, I've seen examples of where here's an inappropriate use of affirmative action, and this is a completely different subject.
Right.
Some whites will say, well, what, we're gonna bring in all these immigrants from Africa, and talk how well that they're doing in these Ivy League schools, just to kind of, if you will, throw African Americans under the bus. And people know exactly what it is, man. Because again, Black Americans have been here for 500 years, and we know the games that are being played, sometimes negatively against us. And oftentimes, these newer immigrants won't get it because they're new to America, and many of them, of course, want to get here because of the ideal of the American dream and all of that. And that's to be understood. But I say that to say, listen, there has been a long history of African American achievement throughout the centuries,
Mhm.
many successes. And unfortunately, not enough of us really focus on all of the successes that we have made. And again, I'm thrilled to death that new Smithsonian Museum of African American History opened, because it tells the national story of who and what we are, and our ongoing contributions to this country and to the world.
Hey, someone's asking, what if Marcus Garvey made it to Liberia as he planned, but it didn't happen? What if
What
Marcus Garvey actually made it to the continent? What kind of impact would that have had?
you know, Garvey. That's a great question, and I often wonder why he never ever made it to the African continent. Du Bois, of course, he does. Du Bois goes to Liberia, to Ghana, etc. That's a good question. Now, I do know, and I want your listening audience to understand this. Garvey was an amazing organizer. He was a charismatic leader. He spoke to the common man and all of that, man. But I do want to say this about the UNIA. Many people think that the UNIA was an anomaly, that it came out of the air. And if you get a chance to read the Booker T. Washington papers, which are 15 volumes,
Hmm.
and those volumes range between 300 and 500 pages, you'll discover that Garvey and Washington began corresponding Garvey began corresponding to Washington in 1912 up until his death in 1915. And you'll discover that the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, is a replica of the Booker T. Washington Tuskegee model. Now, I think that there was a possibility that the UNIA could have worked if it could have got a real foothold in Liberia. It could have. Now, I'm not an expert in this area, so I really can't give the person who asked the question a broad, in-depth explanation of it. And but I would say this, that he or she may want to look at the work of I believe it's Tyreen Wright. She's a
Right.
professor at CUNY State.
I'm still trying to get in contact with her.
Right, and she wrote a book called Booker T. Washington: The Making of a Pan-Africanism, and she discusses at length the interaction between Washington and Garvey. Also, too, there's some footage online with Dr. John Hendrick Clark in regards to Garvey, and he was somewhat of an expert on Garvey. Now, and from there, I would look at maybe some of the contemporary scholars who are experts on on the work on the life and works of Marcus Garvey. I unfortunately am not an expert in the area.
Okay, let's see what else we have here. So, and cool, see, I believe the numbers you're giving are inflated because I know a lot of African immigrants here in America are struggling. But he's saying African Americans' median household net worth is $1,700, and African immigrants is $70,000.
Okay.
I don't think. I think that's not true.
Let me stop here. There are over 50 million African Americans in the United States.
Right.
So, it's interesting that people try to make these comparison between a few African immigrants. Now, I think where the comparison should go, let's just take a country like Nigeria, which has roughly 200 million people. Most people don't realize that 70% of Nigerians live on less than $5 a day. Mm-hmm. $5 a day. So, I mean, it's how do you make this comparison between a few African immigrants and 50 million African Americans? I mean, I don't understand where the logic is with that at all. It makes no sense. I'm not impressed, and you know what? I'm not impressed with immigrants who are coming to a country which is already developed.
Right.
The United States was built not by recent African immigrants. The United States was built on the backs of African Americans. Those African immigrants are here because of African Americans. So I'm not really impressed by those few people who are here, who are benefiting from the legacy of the African American experience.
That was powerful.
Well, no, it's the truth.
I mean, you're absolutely right. I can't disagree.
I mean, honestly, there is no United States without Black America. Doesn't exist. It just doesn't exist. How in the world can you compare the history of recent immigrants to a people who've been here for 500 years and who've suffered marginalization to build the country? As a matter of fact, they built the most powerful nation on the face of the earth. Who else has done that? No one else has. And this is why I think that African Americans should never ever marginalize their contributions. Our contributions are massive. I mean, really, there is no comparison to. We are a distinct population of African people within the U.S. context. There's no one like us. And for African immigrants who are coming here today, well, listen, good for them. I'm glad that they're able to benefit from the American experience. But as we talked before, man, if you were to ask me, Dinas, how have these African immigrants benefited African Americans? They haven't.
Right.
They have not. Now, if you've asked me how have African Americans benefited the entire nation? Oh my God, Well, we built the country. I mean, that's just the way it is. So, I mean, I'm not impressed by that at all. If the person who's asking the question, I don't know what African country that she's from or he's from, I mean, wherever their country of origin is, how are they doing for their citizens? How are they living? I mean, there was a reason why they came to the United States.
Hmm. So I just want you to repeat that one more time. So basically, we shouldn't be impressed by
I'm
immigrants
not.
who
No,
come to America,
no.
which is a country that's already established.
How can I be? I'm sorry. There is no way that I can be impressed by that. No, not at all. Listen, Dinas, the economy of this country is tied up to with Black Americans. The banking system. We built the railroads, right? The Ivy League institutions. I mean, I can go on and on and on and on and on. We are anchored in the entire country. The Constitution mentions Black Americans more than anybody. So, I mean, how am I supposed to be impressed by a few immigrants who come here, right?
Mhm.
And again, white Americans will play this game as if these people are somehow superior, and they're not. Because if you were superior, if then your country of origin would be developed. But you're coming here for a reason. So I just can't. It makes no sense, and it shows to me that the people who play into this have a lack of understanding regarding basic U.S. history. And this is not only about African immigrants; it's immigrants from Latin America or these other places that seem not to understand U.S. history or how this country came into being. I'm just, I'm in no way impressed at all. And I say that because I have a clear understanding of the contributions of Black Americans to the making of the United States.
Hmm. Okay, so we have to do another show just on that. I'm
No,
serious. We have
I
to.
mean,
The next show, we have to do what we have to do. We have to really
I
just.
mean, I mean, Dinas, I mean, I can't be. I'm just not
I'm not.
impressed. I
I mean,
mean,
you're absolutely right.
I mean, think about this, Dinas. Here it is. I've given you. We were enslaved for hundreds of years. And because of this marginalization, we had to kind of create our own separate institutions. We weren't going to get any help from African countries. It was not going to happen. I gave you an example not too long ago of way back in the 1920s. There were some Chinese American immigrants who were being marginalized and discriminated against in California by white Americans.
Mm-hmm.
These immigrants were able to reach out to the government of China, their former country of origin, and says, "Hey, we're being discriminated against by our new adopted country, America. Do you know that China could speak on their behalf?" Now, take for example, African Americans have never had anyone to speak on our behalf, ever.
Right.
We have been on our own. As a matter of fact, we're still on our own. We cannot depend on Africa to do really anything for us because they haven't. It has not happened at all. Now, I can give you many, many examples of where we have actually engaged the African continent. But the Africans have never engaged us in a meaningful way, in a measurable way that has changed our quality of life in here. So, am I supposed to be impressed by a few African immigrants who are doing well at schools here?
Mm-hmm.
No. Those Ivy League institutions were built on the backs of African Americans. Harvard, Yale, Princeton, all of them were built on the backs of Black Americans, not recent African immigrants. I'm not impressed. I'm sorry. I'm just not impressed with that at all. What I am impressed with, man, is that the long legacy of African American resistance in this country. I'm impressed by that.
Mm-hmm.
Not only the long legacy of African American resistance in this country, but also in Canada. That old saying that we made a way out of no way, we did. And guess what? We didn't get any help from continental Africans.
No, you're right.
None at all. No help. I would have loved, you know what, Dinus, I would love to say that we got help.
Mm-hmm.
That somebody from some country says, didn't happen. Just didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
So when I see this, when I see people bragging about what recent African immigrants have done, I'm not impressed. We built the country. we, we built the country. We built the most powerful nation on the face of the globe. We took America to the moon. We gave America all of its forms of music, inventions. I mean, it goes on and on and on and on and on. This is the African American narrative. So I'm just, I can't be impressed because I know the contribution that we've made and are making, and we've done it on our own. I would have loved to have said, you know what, we've had some help along the way. And now I will say this: the Caribbean immigrants who came to America, they embraced us.
Right.
The early Haitians, once they fought for their independence, they says, okay, any black person in the New World who wants to settle here, they did. Yes. Stokely Carmichael and some of the other Caribbean immigrants who came, yes, they absolutely embraced us, and they became, if you will, a part of the African American experience. Africa, on the other hand, it just has not happened in that way. I'm sorry. And that is unfortunate, and that's just where we are. Now, I would love someone in your chat room to say, well, Professor Davis, here's an example of what Africa has done for the Black diaspora. And I've yet to have that conversation.
All right. Well, hey, Professor Davis, thank you. I mean, I completely agree. I cannot disagree with you at all. Now, but so someone in the chat room saying the Chinese now own a lot in America and across the planet. But again, the Chinese, they get help from China. They have their own ecosystems pretty much set up in every place they go, backed by China. They have their own banks, their own everything.
Yeah, but let me just say this, man. And people are always saying that China is definitely a threat, not a threat, but they're definitely a competitor with the United States. But let me be clear, man, in terms of the Western world. And what I mean by the Western world is the U.S., Canada, Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand. All of those nations that I just named, man, are on one accord, right? Mm-hmm. And and they are a force to be reckoned with. Yes, China is rising, no question about it. But if people think that the United States and Canada and Western Europe and Australia and New Zealand, man, are somehow going to just go away, and not have an influence on the world, well, unfortunately, you don't understand global politics and the global economic system. That Western group is a force to be reckoned with, and they will always be a strong political player, period. And they are strategically located across the globe. They are strategically located across the globe. So they will always serve as a counterbalance against China. Keep in mind, man, that the United States has been the #1 superpower since 1871. And even today, man, we're still roughly 25% of the world's GDP. We're one country, 25%. So I just think this is something to take into consideration when we talk about China, and the West.
Hey, well, with that being said, brother Professor Davis, let's go ahead and close out.
Yes, sir. Well, listen, Dinus, as always, thank you so much for inviting me on your show. I hope that I was able to provide some information that was useful to your listeners and to your viewers. If anyone is interested in contacting me, they can reach me via email. And my email is going to be Davis, Davis, L as in Larry, N as in Nathaniel, 20750 and again, thank you for allowing me to kind of express and share this information with people. And again, I just think that that African Americans really should should command their history and understand their contributions to the United States. That African American history is American history, also too, but it has had an impact on the globe, and that we should never ever be ashamed of who we are, what our history was, or what the contributions that we've made. I mean, honestly, our contributions are massive, and they're global, and and honestly, they could stand up against anybody. And I just think not enough of us know our contributions. So I'll I'll probably be back on your show, man, promoting my book if that's okay with you.
Oh man, Professor Davis, absolutely. Whenever you just let me know. I'll probably be reaching back out to you to come on the show anyway. So whenever you're more than welcome. You can use my platform to promote your book, DVD, whatever you got. No problem. Absolutely.
Which actually documents this information, man. And again, everything I'm pretty much saying, Dinus, is it can be documented. It can be documented, man, and it's factual. And so I just think that's important. And again, I really think that Black Americans should be proud of who and what they are, man. And again, their contributions that they've made to the American experience and to the globe.
Absolutely. Well, Professor Davis, I'm gonna have you back on later on this week. So
Okay.
I appreciate it. And if you want to promote the book, then that's fine. Anytime.
Well, thank you, sir.
Thank you. All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Search for Huru. Make sure you like, subscribe, share on Instagram, that Twitter, and Facebook. Search for Huru. Also go to searchforhuru.com, go to dynasmir.com, and go to amazon.com. And please search your name, Dynasty Amir, and please buy a book. Till next time, Dynasty Amir, search for Huru. Peace.